Good evening and welcome to the York County History Center's hosting of the York Civil War Roundtable. We hope that you had a great holiday season and that despite the ongoing issues our country is currently facing, that your 2021 is beginning to look a little bit brighter than 2020 certainly did. My name is Adam Bentz, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Library and Archives at the York County History Center, and I'm very happy to be hosting tonight and fielding questions from our online audience. What we would ask is, as uh, as Jim and Scott go through their presentation, that you would hold on to your questions. There are multiple opportunities to participate tonight, and I think as both of them will acknowledge in their presentation, tonight is supposed to be an interactive discussion as much as possible. So please feel free to think up questions and to bring them to my attention in the chat feature on Zoom. That would be the easiest way to do it. And I will pass them on to Jim and Scott. If you could indulge me for a few minutes, I'm going to go through some upcoming events. We have 3 events I'd like to discuss coming up at the History Center for the month of January, beginning with tomorrow evening. That's January 21st at 7 o'clock p.m. We're featuring our community historian, Ophelia Chambliss, who will be presenting her work involved with our Share Your History program, something the Library and Archives has worked on for several years now. And Ophelia has been a key participant in these events and in raising awareness about the History Center's efforts to be more inclusive in what we collect and to try to encourage community members to come forward and to give us oral histories and photos and other things related to their communities. So tomorrow night, Ophelia will be especially discuss the importance of sharing African American history and her upcoming Juneteenth exhibit, which will be at the History Center, I believe, starting in May. On January 23rd, I keep forgetting, let's see, 21st is tomorrow night. So January 23rd would be Saturday. We will be having an online version of our Family Day event, which we've hosted for several years. This will be an entirely virtual event. Unfortunately, everybody knows what's going on, and the History Center has been very committed to keeping people safe at this time. So please check our website for details. The theme of this year's Family Day is Who is Your Hero? So please check out our website and participate in this event. That's coming up on Saturday. And then on January 26th, that's Tuesday, January 26th, we'll be featuring an 18th century cooking demonstration. This will be conducted by Christine Cooper, who is our manager of public programs. She will be doing this event. She's done multiple demonstrations. I should say she has done multiple demonstrations in 2020, and this will be the first one for 2021. This will take place at the Summer Kitchen in the Colonial Complex. We're not asking you to attend in person. It could be pretty cold out there, but please check out our website. This will be a virtual event, and you'll be able to participate online. All right. Probably of primary importance to many people who are attending tonight, our next York Civil War Roundtable Zoom webinar will be taking place a month from now on February 17th. That's the 3rd Wednesday in February, again at 7 o'clock p.m., our usual start time. And we will be inviting Peter C. Mealy, I'm probably mispronouncing that, the executive director of the Seminary Ridge Museum in Gettysburg, Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center in Gettysburg, and he will be presenting his work, The Work for Freedom, Life in the Pennsylvania Borderlands, 1840 to 1865. And I will read this description here, which I think is very fascinating, very timely for our country, talking about the Civil War and the events preceding it. South Central Pennsylvania is known for the Battle of Gettysburg, the largest military clash in the Western Hemisphere. Over the course of 25 years, however, this area was a battleground for a different kind, as the hills and valleys of this region represented both freedom and danger for free and self-emancipating African Americans. As a network of free African Americans and whites emerged to protect escaping enslaved and free citizens, slave catchers frequently prowled the area, looking to kidnap these freedom seekers and sell them south into bondage. During the Civil War, African Americans from the small towns and cities of south central Pennsylvania flocked to the United States Army to strike back at the institution of slavery. These stories shed new light on what was at stake during the 4 years of fighting. Topics covered in this presentation include the kidnapping of Kitty Payne, 1845, Daniel Kaufman and the Underground Railroad in 1847, Frederick Douglass and John Brown in Chambersburg in 1859, and the 54th Massachusetts in Franklin County, that's 1863. So please jot this date down, February 17th. We'll see each other again online at a distance. And I think this could be a great presentation. And I believe both Jim and Scott will be talking about a lot of these themes tonight. All right, introducing tonight's speakers is something that I've been privileged to do a few times in 2020. Both of them have presented multiple times at our Roundtable events, as well as many other events. Scott L. Mingus, Sr. is a retired research scientist who holds U.S. patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. He is a prolific author of 22 Civil War era books and articles for multiple publications, as well as 6 scenario books for Civil War miniature wargaming. He manages the YCWRT Facebook page, writes the Cannonball blog on yorkblog.com, and is a frequent speaker at our Roundtable events. Jim McClure retired 2 years ago now, after 30 years with the York Daily Record, where he served as editor for 15 years. He's the author or co-author of 7 books on York County and holds a master's in American Studies from Penn State, focusing on the history of York County journalism. He manages the Retro York page on Facebook and writes the Yorktown Square blog on yorkblog.com. He serves as editor of our History Center Publications Committee and recently began the witnessingyork.com website with Dr. Jamie Kinsley. As I said, I'm Adam Bentz, and I will be here tonight to gather and field questions as we go through the evening. So please feel free to reach out on our chat feature. Disregard what I forgot to remove from the slides. This is an interactive presentation, so there will be multiple breaks for questions during tonight's presentation. So without further ado, I am going to stop my share. And I will turn things over. I believe Jim is going to begin sharing tonight.
That is correct. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. And thank you very much for the intro, Adam, and assembling us here tonight in the Civil War Roundtable. I remember when Civil War Roundtable was meeting in Borders 20 years ago, maybe more than 20 years ago. And at that time, no one was talking, very few people were talking about the Civil War, but the Civil War Roundtable was, the Civil War in York County. And the Civil War Roundtable really kept the flame alive, and look where we are today. It's a major point of discussion. The things undergirding the Civil War are huge today in our nation. They're huge in York County. So I'm glad that the Civil War Roundtable was so diligent and so was able to see how important all this is. And it's great to partner with Scott Mingus again on another project. He's a friend, and he's a scholar, and he pushes you in a good way to do really better work. So I'm going to try to go to the next screen. Okay, it's a little slow there. Had me a little worried. What we did with this the book, The Civil War Stories from York County, is this was kind of a collection of 2 earlier books that you see there, plus a lot of new material. The idea was to capture voices of this generation. Actually, those people alive know Civil War soldiers, knew Civil War soldiers. So we wanted to get those stories, and we when we published the first 2 volumes, we kept collecting stories, and then we put them together into this volume. I think that also you could say that I did a book called East of Gettysburg around 2005. Scott did Flames, which really was kind of an overall view of Civil War in York County. And Scott did Flames Beyond Gettysburg, which really drilled down deeply into the Confederate invasion in York County in 1863. And the book kind of completes the trilogy in many ways, because it brings many, many stories, new stories that just we didn't have, or we didn't have access to at the time when each of us were doing our earlier work. So I think you could think of these 3 books as a trilogy. We're going to start with the Underground Railroad here tonight, and I want to go over a couple big picture views, and then Scott will jump in and talk about some of the operators on the Underground Railroad. And I ran across this, I think it was on Library of Congress page. It's very, it just caught my eye, caught me. And this, what we're seeing here are, it's kind of graded, you know, and from in the darkness, the different darkness scales of gray there, in terms of the number of enslaved people in these counties. And you can see that the counties, the star where York County is, and you can see the number of enslaved people within really walking distance from York County. You can see it gets lighter, but you can see how it points. This points to York County, and you'll see as we go to other slides that Scott will do and that I will do, that there's kind of a shift towards the northeast. They kind of followed the valleys, the river valleys and so forth, but they really wanted to get across the river into Lancaster and up to Philadelphia and New York and then Canada. So if you can't, it may be a little hard to see some of those numbers, but Carroll County, I'll just fill in the, if you see the orange star, that's York County, and then the stories, the county is touching us. Hartford is 9.1% enslaved people. Baltimore County to the west is 6.4%, and then Carroll County is 3.4%. And one of the things to think about there is that even though, and Pennsylvania, by the way, did not have enslaved people at that point, gradual emancipation started in 1780. So, but you know, the ideas behind slavery, we were bordering on a state, a slave state, a state that enabled enslavement. We were bordering on that, and so the ideas in the that were inherent in Maryland and the South didn't stop at the Mason-Dixon line. They came across here, and what we're going to be talking about tonight, and Scott will show voting patterns in particular. You'll see that it's pretty. York County was a pretty complicated place in the 1860s, and I believe in many ways it still is. You know, this is another map, just in terms of overview. And this came from the Tubman Center in Cambridge, Maryland. And I just took a picture of one of the maps there. And you can see that, you know, you can see you can see Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and kind of a concentration of red lines there. And you can see a line going kind of north, and that's going right through York County. And then the other lines going towards Philadelphia. So you can see just in this one little snapshot here, this map here, how integral York County was to the Underground Railroad. So here we have a national center that's kind of saying you guys are right kind of in the middle of it. So what did happen to the freedom seekers whenever they reached York County? And Scott will tell us now what happened.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate it. Thanks, Adam, for hosting the meeting. If you look at this map, which I had created by a friend of mine, Stephen Stanley, for the book on the Underground Railroad in York County, you can see the major routes that came through York County. As Jim mentioned, the goal was to get folks out of York County and to across the river in particular, and then eventually, of course, to New York, Philadelphia, and for many participants, particularly in the 1850s, on to Canada. And the reason I show this is because York County had multiple routes. So most of the county was involved. As we know, this was highly illegal. This was against the laws of the United States. Many people that were clearly involved in the Underground Railroad, we identify in the Underground Railroad book that I wrote and also in our new book. But one of the things that's particularly interesting to me is the fact that since I published through the York County History Center, The Ground Swallowed Them Up, Slavery and the Underground Railroad in York County, Pennsylvania, I've actually never stopped researching the Underground Railroad. I've continued to be interested in the topic, even though I've moved on to write other Civil War books. Local Underground Railroad history has been still something that I've been passionate about. And one of the things I've wanted to do is try to locate some of those Underground Railroad sites that at the time of the publication of The Ground Swallowed Them Up either weren't known or weren't terribly clear, or I didn't feel confident enough at that point to actually put them in a book. So Jim's in my new book. For those of you who've read it, you understand where I'm going. For those of you who have not read it, you'll see further descriptions. But I want to talk about 3 Underground Railroad sites that we've located in 2020. In the middle of all the pandemic, things like that, as it was safe to go around, I had a chance to start searching for some of these sites. One of the ones that's always intrigued me was the Prigg versus Pennsylvania legal case, which in 1842 the US Supreme Court ruled against the state of Pennsylvania and ruled for the slave owners, in particular the Ashmore family and Edward Prigg, who was their attorney and hired slave catcher. Background of the story was that a African-American woman by the name of Margaret Ashmore had a number of slaves that had left that her late husband had apparently allowed to leave. One of those was Margaret Morgan. She had married a free black man named Jerry Morgan. They had moved first to the Fine Grove area, Peach Bottom area, and then they moved farther north to the vicinity of Airville. Mrs. Morgan was actually kidnapped with 6 children by slave catchers. They thought they were following the law, but they missed a key step. And so the state of Pennsylvania took them to court, found Prigg and his 3 cohorts guilty of kidnapping, 7 counts, 6 of children, 1 of adults, and commiserately sentenced them to jail. Now, by pre-arrangement, the state of Maryland had agreed that no penalty was going to be meted out to the individuals involved in this case. They would simply be turned over to the US Supreme Court. But this whole thing started with Mrs. Ashmore trying to figure out where these slaves were to begin with. And of course, the one that is the most interest to us is Mrs. Morgan. Now, we know that her husband, Jerry Morgan, was working on a hayfield on the Wallace farm. But where is the Wallace farm and where is it today? Can we still find this location? When researching The Ground Swallowed Them Up, I found court documents in Bel Air, Maryland that I'd never read before. In fact, I don't think anybody had used them in any publications. One of the key things that was located was a affidavit from the Maryland trial of Mrs. Morgan, where it talked about the fact that Jerry Morgan was first spotted working in this hayfield on the Wallace farm. So using this 1860 map from the Library of Congress, I started looking for the Wallace farm in the area of Airville. Now, there's no Airville in 1860. It wasn't called Airville. So it took me a little bit of research to realize that Airville was actually then called Lower Chanceford Post Office. And based on that, that was the key to finding where the location of the 2 Wallace farms were. Now, I'm not saying that this is the actual site of the kidnapping, although I strongly suspect it was. Wallace had 2 homes, one of which was, I believe, the lower one in the yellow square is probably his main home. The other one set back off the road to the north in very rough terrain is probably where the Morgans would have lived, presumably. Obviously, there's no proof. I continue to look for that. But if you look at the photograph on the left, I believe this is the first photograph taken of the presumed site of the Morgan kidnapping, somewhere in this general vicinity. And the Wallaces had a huge farm. Much of that is today covered with trees, so the exact location is unknown. But I think we're close, and at least we're in the ballpark of where Jerry and Margaret Morgan were. Jim, the second property that I'm interested in was the property, go ahead, was the property of Ezekiel and Eliza Baptiste. Now, there's not a lot known originally about Ezekiel Baptiste. He's mentioned a few times in some York County histories, particularly George Prohl and John Gibson's two histories of York County. Doing research on Ezekiel and Eliza Baptiste, we found out that they had a model farm. In fact, this was one of the first large-scale African-American owned and operated farms in all of York County. In fact, in most of southern Pennsylvania. This farm was a showplace, and people came from far and wide. In fact, as far away, we believe, from New York to come south to the Baptiste farm. Dr. Israel Betts, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, talked about a lot about the history of the Newberry Township area. And one of the things he talks about was the home of the Baptistes. And again, found it on the map in the lower left-hand corner, went out to the property and found where the Baptiste farm would have been. So on this very property you see in the photograph, we believe Harriet Tubman visited at least once, maybe twice. The evidence isn't clear on exactly how many times she came to York County, but Harriet Tubman would have slept here on this property. The third property, Jim, that we want to talk about that we mentioned in our new book is one that researcher Donna Peace from Summit Grove down in southern York County, the campgrounds, has been researching for many years, as well as numerous other people. And Donna and I kind of matched our notes, if you will, and we believe that together we've located the site of the Samuel Berry House. As you may remember, if you've read my book on the Underground Railroad in York County, Samuel and Miriam Berry were among the leading conductors in the late 1840s through the mid-1850s in southern York County. They were African Americans, as were the Baptistes and Mrs. Morgan, of course. But the location of where the Berry House was has been uncertain. Again, using the 1860 period maps, matching that up with other accounts, including the autobiography of the Berry's daughter, Amanda, we believe we again located the approximate location of the Berry House. Unfortunately, the actual site is probably under I-83, which bisected the old road. If you see the map down there in the blue area, there's a small mark where a tenant house presumably was. That was probably the Berry's house, and I-83 runs smack through the middle of that property today. So you see the approach road in the photograph I took on the right. I-83 is just beyond the trees. The road stops right where the tree line is in the background. So we believe one of the things that's the highlight of our new book is you can read the more full accounts of the discovery that I've made on these things. And again, Donna has certainly contributed significantly to the finding of the Berry location. So it's one of the things that we think you'll find intriguing about the new book is some of the new research that's come out recently. Okay, Jim?
Maybe I could ask if you could talk about what happened to Jerry Morgan and that family, because it's so compelling and so sad.
Yeah, I mean, that whole case has just some fascinating overtones from the fact that a York attorney tried the case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. To my knowledge, it may have been the very first time a York attorney presented a York County case to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the Morgans themselves weren't around by the time Supreme Court Craig versus Pennsylvania case occurred. Jerry Morgan had repeatedly tried to get Pennsylvania's governor, Rittner, involved in the case. He took a canal boat up to Harrisburg from Columbia, and unfortunately on his return trip after successfully seeing the governor, he either leaped or was pushed off the canal boat and drowned in the Tidewater, actually in the State Line Canal just north of Columbia. Margaret Morgan and the 6 kids were held in Bel Air in the Hartford County Jail. They were eventually sold, we believe. Nobody's quite sure what happened to them. Thomas Hambley, the attorney that tried the case in front of the Supreme Court, believed that the Morgans, the mom and the 6 kids, were sold and taken to Georgia to a slave catcher, to a slave dealer, and probably spent the rest of their lives in the cotton fields there. However, there's other accounts that maybe Mrs. Morgan was actually taken to Iowa when the Ashmore family moved out west after all the rigmarole with the Supreme Court. Other accounts suggest that maybe Mrs. Morgan was sold to somebody in the Baltimore area and lived the rest of her life there. We just simply don't know. But Mrs. Morgan and her children almost certainly never regained their freedom.
Good, and I'll finish up this segment talking about the Goodridges. I'll say that in terms of the U.S. Supreme Court, you know, the Prey case was a landmark case, obviously, and we've had two other cases of some magnitude. One was FCC versus Redline Broadcasting in the 1960s, and another one, just this recent one, was Snyder versus Westboro Baptist. But that's about it. I think there might have been one other one, but it didn't rise to the level of these three cases. Say of all these cases, the Prey case was the most influential in America. One of the things that you often hear whenever historians do work on the Underground Railroad is the criticism is that they tend to look at only the white station operators, those that are involved, the Quakers. And in your county, it's really a gift that so many people of color were involved in the Underground Railroad. And not only that, but the husband and wife were involved. And that makes common sense, I think, when you realize how all consuming it was. They put their life on the line, they put their families, life on the line. And so you'd have to be all in. And so Scott showed three examples. Here's a fourth example, and it involved William and Evelina, who was known as Emily Goodrich. And so we talk about William C. Goodrich a lot. The Goodrich Freedom Center was where Evelina and William Goodrich lived. They had the business at Center Hall. Evelina, there's not a lot known about her. There's the Goodriches, the biography on the Goodriches was written in about 1999 by a professor by the name of John Vincent Ziersky. I never can pronounce that correctly, but at the time there wasn't a lot known about Evelina. We know they married in 1827. Their first child was Glenn Alvin, and who was well-known teacher photographer. And also they had 11 children, 6 who were coming in about 1850. A couple of their children went on to photo fame up in East Saginaw, Michigan. And the last one to die was Wallace. I think he died in 1922. Interestingly, Evelina's maiden name as his name. Evelina died in 1852, and it's thought that she died of heart disease. There was heart disease in the family, and other of her children died of heart disease. So it's possible that she died of heart disease. William C. Goodrich outlived her by, he died in 1873. So it's interesting that after she died, the Goodrich business didn't do so well. I just want to read a piece from Jazersky's book. This is real quick, so you can relax. I'm not going to read a long passage here. But she was remembered in later years as a wife who had assisted her husband materially in his business in New York. The narrative of William C. Goodrich's success and the subsequent accomplishments of his and Evelina's children, however, testify to full partnership and not mere assistance in that enterprise. So a full partner here with William C. Goodrich, Evelina, or Emily Goodrich, in the same way that those presented by Scott were full partnerships as well. So that wraps up that particular segment. We're glad to take questions from anybody, any viewers out there.
If I could break in, we have 2 different questions, and I actually thought of a small question to ask. But the first in line, this is from Bill. He's asking about the age and source of the sick and wounded soldiers map that you showed earlier, Jim.
Yeah, I haven't checked back I think it was a contemporary, meaning 1860 in that range. But I didn't go and look at the provenance of the map. It seemed to make sense with other maps I've seen, including the one that I did show from the Tubman Center. It tended to corroborate. And it was commonly used at that time. So the short answer is it was the Civil War era that it came out. But I know a lot beyond that.
Right. Second question is from Craig. I think this question would be for Scott. Going back to the Berry house that you were talking about, where would that be on a north-south basis?
Thanks. Yeah, that's south of Shrewsbury. Actually, if you head down the trail from Shrewsbury, cut across I-83 and come back, you'll find it. Probably the easiest road that people may be aware of is I think it's called Oakwoods. There's a pond right along the Susquehanna Trail, a couple miles south of Shrewsbury. That pond is Oakwoods. That's where the Lowe's campground formerly was during the Civil War and post-Civil War era. So that's the area we're talking about. That road, Oakwoods Road, part of that would have been the old farm lane that cut over to the Stewartstown Road, which is on the east side of I-83.
Okay. We have several more questions. This is from Gary. Center Hall, is that located in Center County?
No, the town of Center Hall is, yeah. But Center Hall, as we're describing it, is actually the building you see on the screen currently. That was the emporium, if you will, that William Goodrich owned. It was one of the tallest buildings in York. It was on the northwestern corner of the town square. It was there during the Civil War, well after the Civil War. Goodrich rented it out. And after the war, there were a number of other owners who went through a wide variety of owners. It's where, for some of you folks who've been in York County, you might be aware of Bear's department store. I believe, Jim, that's correct. This was the location.
That's correct. Yes, that's right. Yeah. They likely tore it down and to build what's Bear's, and it became Market Way West, and now it's an apartment apartments or condos in the old Bear's department store. It's a shame that it was torn down, just like many of our buildings have been, important buildings have been. But yeah, it was in that angle of the square. If you remember Bear's, that's where it was.
Yeah, and again, the center, of course, came because it was the center square of York, as the square was known during the 1800s.
Right. This is from Ronald. Is the Goodrich mural, well, I know the answer to this, although I can't remember the exact street location. Is the Goodrich mural located in York?
Yeah, it is. It's downtown, but like you, I don't remember where
the
exact address.
I don't know the address, but it's way out on West Market Street, near the intersection of Richland coming in. Out in the deep into West Market Street.
Yep. East side of Penn Street Market is what Nicole Gaines has mentioned to us.
Question.
I think there was a question about Carlisle. Adam came in for someone.
Yes, this is from Gary. Any reason why Dillsburg on the way to Carlisle or Harrisburg was not an underground route?
Oh, actually there were. Harrisburg was a major stop on the Underground Railroad. In fact, most of the routes out of northern York County went into Harrisburg. In fact, from Harrisburg, I give talks on the Underground Railroad along the Susquehanna River going all the way up to Williamsport. So I can trace the routes all the way up to the New York line, in fact, and do give PowerPoint talks on that. So yeah, they were majorly involved. The Warrington Quaker Meeting House, so obviously the Dillsburg area was heavily involved as well. So Jim, if you may want to flip back to that map just for a second to show Gary. No, yeah, keep going back to the map.
Oh, okay, your map?
Yes, please.
That map.
There we go. So again, you can see the route through Lewisberry. Now, Wellsville area, there was a route, though, a small route. It wasn't a major route. That ran from Wellsville up through Dillsburg, hit up towards And again, in Dillsburg, they would turn and went to Harrisburg. But the major route was to go through Lewisberry because there were far more Quakers in the Lewisberry area, and it was far more remote. Must keep in mind that Dillsburg was right on the middle of the state road. So that was the main route between Carlisle and York. It was heavily patrolled. And so you didn't really want to take people through Dillsburg because there's just so much traffic on that route. It was much smarter and much easier to facilitate to take them through Lewisberry, through all those backcountry roads that we all know so well in northern York County. Far easier to hide people in that area. But yeah, Dillsburg was involved, but not to the great degree.
And you can see on this, and you can see on this map here from the Tubman Center, that line that goes north right through York County, that supports what what Scott was just saying about a major traffic pattern was to go up the Susquehanna.
Yeah, and just very quickly, just north of Harrisburg, the other major collection point was the area of Sealands Grove area, Sunbury, that general region, Shamokin. There was a lot of activity in that area that would store folks and get them ready for the long walk north.
All right, I think that we're caught up in questions. I just had a very brief question. When following Emily's passing, did William Goodridge remarry?
Not as much, not that we know. So. He stayed in York until there's some conflicting information about this, but his business was still listed in 1865. But by then he had moved north to Minnesota. So he had children in the area, and then he joined his children who had moved north to establish businesses and so forth later in his life.
Right. I think we're ready for your next section then.
Yeah, when you do these presentations, it's hard to know where to start in terms of what people know and what they don't. So this slide here, we've tried in this presentation to bring forth information that's new or that we haven't talked about a lot. This information you might have heard before, but I think it's important to go over for all kinds of reasons, but it helps maybe create the big picture in terms of what happened particularly in 1863, June 1863, when the Confederates came through here. Essentially about 11,000 Confederates came here through York County before the Battle of Gettysburg, and they were going to the Wrightsville Bridge. They were heading that way. They went throughout the county. A major column by Juba Early came in through the Davisburg Road from Adams County, East Berlin, Davisburg Road. Another column came what is now route the York Gettysburg Pike, and then a third column went down through Hanover and Spring Grove into Hanover Junction. So they were spread out throughout the county. And here's kind of when they got here, York went out to meet them. York's fathers went out to meet them and in an area of farmers, which we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail. And they surrendered the town, and the Confederates came in and occupied for I think it's 43 hours, more than 40 hours. So that's the big picture. We can talk more in the questions area, but if you just the surrender in many ways kind of stifled discussion for decades and decades in the 20th century, because you don't normally like to talk about an event like that. It kind of, the Civil War kind of was supplement to other wars, and it wasn't until really around the year 2000 that that really the local Civil War discussion took really took flight. But if you take these other points in by themselves, these are stories that many towns would point to and be proud of, but they've been sublimated by the surrender. So I'll go through these really quickly because I know that many of you know this, but I think they're worth repeating. One is that 5,000 men served from York County at least, and 600 died, more than 600 died. These are just men who could be documented. Dennis Brandon's done a lot of that work. And there's undoubtedly more, but sticking to those that we could document. Early in the war, we had early responders. The York Rifles were a unit that harkened back to the Revolutionary War, responded early, and some of the training and some of the casualties, some of the experiences they had got back here, and we were able to experience fully the horrors of war. But not only that, we had a major training camp here in York County called Camp Scott, and it was on the old York Fairgrounds, which was at the southeast corner of King and Queen Streets, going out towards Hannah-Penn, now Hannah-Penn School. So there's tens of thousands of recruits that came in here for training. The recruiting and training later moved up to Harrisburg, Camp Curtin up in Harrisburg. We also hosted in 1862 a major military hospital. 200 died, 14,000 were treated here. We had a major battle in Hanover and Wrightsville where people died in those battles. The Battle of Hanover, for example, you really have to wrap your head around this. There's 300 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing from the two armies that clashed in Hanover. In Wrightsville, one person died. He was a black fighting man who came over with other black men from Columbia and was digging trenches, fortifications, to try to stop the onslaught on the bridge by the Confederates. And then he picked up his rifle and was killed by cannon fire. And he's buried today in Wrightsville. So blood was shed here on our soil. Battle of Hanover, think about 300 casualties, just a big price there. And then we had a lot, just tremendous response after the Battle of Gettysburg. We know that the Gettysburg wounded came here, but we went down there and worked in field hospitals. Women and people from York County volunteered to go down there. We also had, Lincoln's had 3 touches to with York County. One was on his way to his inauguration. He was scheduled to come through York County and to be, needed here. And he was in Harrisburg on his way and learned that there's a plot to harm him, and down in Baltimore, took the way through Delaware down to DC, but his train came through York County, and it was met with a lot of disappointment whenever the president-elect wasn't on there. Of course, it's known that he came through Hanover Junction and on through Hanover, on to Gettysburg, and then back again to deliver what became known as the Gettysburg Address. He actually gave a short address in Hanover, where he made an appearance when his train was stopped for a few minutes and said a few things to the audience that was there. So we had a Hanover address that we can point to. And then his funeral train in 1865 came through here and stopped in York, took on water for steam operation, and was, flowers were put on his funeral bier. And, it was a big moment. And then this disruption of families and farms. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but when it comes to talking about the orphanage. But I'll just focus on one, and that is the capturing of horses. Confederates, when they were invading, took at least 1,000 horses. It's hard to know exactly how many, but imagine today if we went out and if someone went out, an enemy came in here and took 1,000 tractors from farmers around York County and parked them at the fairgrounds. That would fill the fairgrounds as where the horses were collected, but it would disrupt the farms of farm life and the farms right at harvest time in York County. Tremendous disruption in all types of ways. So that's 10 moments to point to, and we can answer more whenever we get to the questions area. But Scott, do you have anything to add? There's a lot to add, but any points to make at this point?
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so another couple maps here. I'm trying to create. We're going to talk about the political scene here in this segment, and I want to just kind of create the umbrella again, the big picture. And at one time, York County before 1800 involved York and Adams County. So it was a border, a 40-mile York County border and a 25-mile Adams County border, 65 miles of Mason-Dixon line. And remember, we're up against a slave state of Maryland. So we had real exposure with the South in that way. This map here shows York County at that point went all the way from the Susquehanna River, which if you see Baltimore and work up the Chesapeake Bay from Baltimore, you'll see the river, the Susquehanna heading north. Where it passes the state line is where that's the Delta area, the Peach Bottom area. So that's where York County started. And it went all the way to the top of the mountain, the Penmar area on the mountain. So that's where we were whenever Mason-Dixon laid in 1860s. And so we had this big broad border with Maryland, big long border. Now, after Adams County departed in 1800, we still had 15% of the Mason-Dixon line here in Pennsylvania. So that's a long exposure with the South. And when you have that type of exposure, border counties have throughout America in the Civil War had an ambivalence to them. Scott grew up in an area where I grew up in an area like that along the Ohio River. Scott did as well, where there's real ambivalence towards the Civil War because you're somewhat north, you're somewhat south, and here we are in York County with before 1800, 25% of our border was connected with Maryland, and then after that 15. So we had this really long, and that shaped our business, that shaped our culture, and and the way we thought and the way we acted. So that sets the stage for politics. But I want to just go into one other area very quickly, and this comes from a book by Colin Woodard. And he talks about really that America is 11 nations. York County, on my screen, we're covered up a little bit, but York County is right beside in my screen. I'm not sure what your screen looks like, right beside Adam's picture. And York County would be in the Midlands area. And surrounding us are these 5 other nations. So we're kind of in the middle of these, of 5 nations. And so we had our own identity as in the Midlands, and I'll explain a couple of those, some of those tendencies here. We really were a heartland area. We were unwelcome. We unwelcomed intrusion from government. We had that strong German influence here, and so you can understand maybe why we weren't pro-Lincoln, because it felt like Lincoln was intruding on us. We were apathetic in some ways to governmental things. So the Civil War was a highly political area. So we were, in some ways, didn't really want to get involved with it. We just had this real concern with government intrusion. But meanwhile, we had other tenants pushing in on us. We had the Appalachia Tennessee, which tended to be pro-Lincoln, but below us, we had an area called the Tidewater, which was very much anti-Lincoln. It was kind of they tended to lean towards the South, kind of the planters and the people in Virginia. And because of that difference between Appalachia and the Tidewater, that's why West Virginia split in the middle of the Civil War, because political differences between them. But here we are, both of those are really close to us. Then you have from the north, you have the New England area, pressing down. New England was all for government. So here we were in our area, the Midlands area, that we were kind of laissez-faire about government. We had this influence in the dark blue there, kind of pushing out on us, pro-government. So York County was a complicated place in the Civil War. You might think, well, we're north of the Mason-Dixon line, so of course we were pro-Lincoln, and of course we were anti-slavery, but it was much more complicated than that. And I would submit that even today, it's much more complicated than what we might think, just because of where we're sitting. So now we'll go. That's designed to set up for Scott to talk about a couple maps of his own.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln ran, of course, against 3 other candidates for president. Here in Pennsylvania, most notable opponents were Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge, the Vice President of the United States, who ran here in York County on what was called a fusion ticket or the Reading ticket. If you look at 1860 results, it's fascinating because, as Jim pointed out, Southern York County touched the Mason-Dixon line. And much of that region was highly agrarian. They were politically connected to the South. And as you can see, all the blue, I use the modern convention of blue for Democrats, red for Republicans, although obviously those color schemes didn't exist in 1860 as party derivatives. But if you can see, with the exception of Springfield, which was kind of an anomaly, and Hanover, which was driven by the local newspaper and some very feisty Republicans in that area, most of Southern York County was very heavily Democrat. In fact, Manheim Township voted 172 votes for the vice president and the Reading ticket, and only 2 votes for Abraham Lincoln. As you got farther north into the Cadoruses, North Cadorus, Jackson, West Manchester, the vote tally started becoming more and more closer towards Lincoln. So you got to the point in northern York County, or along the river, in eastern York County, those were bastions of Lincoln's support. Now, some of that came from the fact that, again, northern York County was largely Scots-Irish. You had Welsh, other denominations, other ethnic groups, etc., many of which were, again, connected to Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and tended to be more Yankeedom type people, to use Jim's earlier chart. And of course, most of the folks in Southern York County, many of which were German, had relatives in the Shenandoah Valley. Many of these people had relatives in Maryland, so there was a very close connection. You might think after the Confederates came to York County in 1863, there would have been a lot more people turning towards the government for protection. Jim will show the next slide, you'll see the exact opposite, that more and more people distrusted the government in 1864, and again voted for George Brenton McClellan, the Major General of the United States Army that ran against Abraham Lincoln. So again, you can see this shift, again, more heavily away from President Lincoln. Moving here, just very quick anecdote. I moved to York County in 2001 from Ohio, and I told Jim a couple times that I could have predicted this without even knowing York County, because I moved here being a devout fan of the Cincinnati and Cleveland sports teams. I was shocked to see that most of York County, when I drove around there, a lot of the bumper stickers were the Steelers. When I went to Eastern York County, there was more support for the Eagles, and throughout much of Central and Southern York County, there was a lot of Ravens and Redskins fans, particularly Ravens. And not knowing the politics of York County, I could have predicted this map, 15 years before I drew the map, just based on even today, how connected York County is to the various metropolitan areas near the various parts of the county. So it shows we've always been divided. We're still divided to this day, I think, but it can certainly explain some of that. Jim? Okay, one of the things I wanted to add here was just a few things that we have in the book. It's not all politics, it's certainly not all Underground Railroad. We have a lot of stuff in the book, and obviously in the short presentation, we don't have a chance to really go through a lot of it. But I just want to throw out a few did you knows, and we talk more about these in the book. 130th Pennsylvania was the first regiment in York County to lose people. They took some significant casualties in the Battle of Antietam. Ironically, these folks have been in uniform less than a month. They were recruited in late August, got their uniforms at the very beginning of September, and on September 17th, they were in combat. So you're only talking about a matter of 3 weeks for many of these people before the combat deaths started. 87th Pennsylvania, of which we have a very good and large reenactor group here in York County. The 87th Pennsylvania was the first major 3-year regiment. It was a regiment that suffered tremendous losses during the Gettysburg campaign. In fact, more than 43% of the regiment were either killed, captured, missing, or wounded at the Second Battle of Winchester, making that, as far as I can tell, the single largest combat losses of any York County regiment by percentage during the entire Civil War. And that regiment also fought at Monocacy, fought during the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg, et cetera, suffered more than 200 men lost. Now, we had a draft in York County. The book talks a fair amount about the draft. The 166th Pennsylvania was the largest regiment comprised of draftees. Every company in that regiment was almost 80 to 90%, if not 100%, comprised of men from York County. Most of us seen the movie Glory, the 54th Massachusetts, rightfully so. It's a tremendous amount of attention in that movie and a lot of the books on Fort Wagner. Did you know that among the regiments that also took heavy losses at Fort Wagner was one with, again, York County ties, the 76th Pennsylvania, with Major Cyrus Diller and several other men from southwestern York County who fought in the Carolina campaign, Fort Wagner, and places like that. The last regiment in York County to suffer significant losses during the Civil War was the 200th Pennsylvania that were involved in the attack on Fort Stedman just days before the surrender of Robert E. Lee. So again, these are just 5 of the many regiments from York County, but these are probably 5 of the largest known. And many of you in the audience today either are direct descendants of people from these 5 regiments or are come into daily contact with folks who are. Jim?
Yeah, I'm conscious of our time here, and so I'm going to try to move quickly through some of this. Women in York County were always been active in wars and just in everyday life. We know that, and it seems like in the Civil War that was a time where they really entered the public square in a public way. There's a lot out there about what women in York County did, and often it's because of the care they had to give at the military hospital here in York, and also our proximity to Gettysburg. But women in York County did a tremendous a lot. We had all those casualties in Hanover, and there's hospitals set up down there. That women were a prime part of. I want to just talk about the care for the orphans and just maybe drill on that just briefly. And that was the Children's Home of York, and it's still in operation. It was formed in 1865 to accommodate the children of Civil War vets. And it was, and one of the things that struck me when I was looking at this, I think by the way, the Children's Home of York and also the York County Hospital and Home, which is still in existence. Those are 2 areas that really need to be looked at thoroughly. Those are social service areas of the 1800s that are still around. Did a lot of good in the 1800s. Children's Home of York, 10 years after the war, 10 years after it was formed, there's 57 orphans in the Children's Home of York in 1875, and 31 of those were soldiers' orphans. So 10 years after the war, we still had more than 30 orphans left from the Civil War, casualties of the Civil War. So I showed the impact of this war on the county. That just that one little snapshot is really indicative of a lot. Want to just I'll go through quickly this. I want to just try to get at the terror of during the Confederate invasion, the terror that it affected people. And we'll talk about women here. We'll talk about Mary Cadwell Fisher, who was in her house and noticed that outside of her door there was a Confederate sentry posted there. And posted there, all of a sudden was there and remained there. And just imagine for a whole weekend, 43 hours, and translate to a weekend today, that an enemy, an invader, was in York or in York County. Just say in York. And they were there by the thousands. Imagine the uncertainty, the fear. And, she wrote this things about, she didn't know when some signal one unleashed the dogs of war in our midst and give our homes as a prey to the invader. It shows the terror that the townspeople felt. Of course, many of them knew some of the soldiers that were here, but here in this one snapshot, you can see the uncertainty. It would have miserable 43 hours in York County. It would have been a terrorized 43 hours here in York County as the Confederates were here. I want to just talk about 2 other women here. As we're talking about women, this is really a relative of Sean Carbaugh, who is alive today, and a young man that's very interested in history in the Pigeon Hills area. And the widow Elizabeth Emig Zinn was his 5-time great-grandmother, so a member of the family. And she was the woman who hosted Juba Early, the division commander, who was Big Mount. This is the house in Big Mount that's still there. And you can see her question, are you going to destroy us and you're going to take all what we got? She asked Early, and Early assured her not. And so Early ended up settling down there after visiting Gordon and Northern farmers, and said that Widow Zinn was very talkative. Said later that Widow Zinn was very talkative and was provided with a good, clean bed. It must be that the Widow Zinn really warmed up as time went on, because she would talk with him about Stonewall Jackson as he really did. She would talk to him about the value of money, and she was really earthy. And she said at the end, kind of as he's parting, she'll be glad when money is supported again, because it's not worth enough to wipe your behind on now. And Juba Early remembered her, and 10 years later, or some years later, 10 or 20 years later, wrote about his encounter with the Widow Zinn, who offered him a 15-course meal whenever he got back from meeting with John Brown Gordon over in Farmers. So, and then here we are, where the Confederates are moving into York. This is a Saturday night before York, where they're going to come in New York. And Gordon stayed near this house. This was his headquarters in the Farmers area, which is past the west of the York County Airport today. It's a little hamlet there in, I think it's Jackson Township, maybe Paradise Township. It comes together there. But anyway, this is where Gordon stayed. And I want to just read you what he wrote in his memoirs about his time there. He was at this house, and he says, my camp for the night was nearby, and I accepted his invitation to breakfast. That would be Jacob Altland, to have breakfast with him. As I entered the quaint room, one half floored with smooth limestone, and the other half covered with limpid water bubbling clear and pure from the bosom of Mother Earth, my amazement at the singular design was perhaps less pronounced than the sensation of rest which it produced. For many days we had been marching on the dusty turnpikes under a broiling sun, and it is easier to imagine than to describe the feeling of relief and repose which came over me as we sat in that cool room with a hot breakfast served from one side, while from the other, the frugal housewife dipped cold milk from immense jars standing neck deep in water. And then the next sentence says, we entered the city of York on Sunday morning, the next day. So there's a case where there's not indication that that household was terrorized, but that house right there was surrounded by gray clad troops whose intent they didn't know. And so they killed them with kindness, really, or served them with kindness to try to win them over. And I would just say that that there is a spring in the basement of that house. I think it's pretty near that window right there. I've been in the house twice, and you go downstairs and there's a spring down there. So I would, you could just stand there and just imagine what it was like to serve John Brown Gordon, the general in the basement, but yet at the same time not knowing what he would do, and knowing that he was going to move on the next day and occupy York for 43 hours. Scott?
Yeah, one of the things we talk about in the book are the bravery of a lot of the women of York County. This is Ellen Busey Rowland. She took her little children and against all the recommendations, she marched them through the Confederate picket line boldly, brashly, without any reservations to get her kids to safety, where a lot of the folks might have shied away and said, we'll try to figure out some other thing to do. She just walked right up to the Confederates and marched right through them. So this is one of the stories we have in the book. So again, cheap commercial for the book, but if you want to read the whole story of Mrs. Rowland, this happened near Emmetsville, so north of York. roughly in the general area of, about a mile or so just north of the exact Emmetsville town. Go ahead, Jim. A couple other people I want to talk about is Mamie Ruggles, just briefly. Last slide, and I want to talk about Mary Jane Rewalt just briefly. Well, Mary Ruggles was a matron at the hospital. She helped feed a lot of the patients in the hospital. When the Confederates came to York on Sunday, June 28, 1863, she took the flag from the hospital. They were wondering what to do with it. She volunteered to carry the flag to her home. So again, here's a woman who walked right through the Confederate lines. Only in her case, she's got a United States flag hidden under her skirt in her petticoats, wrapped around her. And she just again, bravely walks right through the rebel pickets and walks several blocks through occupied downtown York, bringing the flag to safety. And when the Confederates leave, she reemerges at the hospital. And as far as I can tell, this is the first United States flag to fly again over York, because they put this one up fairly quickly after the Confederates had left. Jim, if you go on to the next slide, we're going to talk about Mary Jane Rewalt, another woman of amazing courage. As we all know, Wrightsville caught on fire when the Union militia ordered 4 citizens of Columbia to burn the bridge, world's longest covered bridge. Mrs. Rewalt, who was the daughter of the Chief Burgess James McGee of Wrightsville, to show her appreciation for General John Gordon and his men for saving Wrightsville, invited him to breakfast the next morning. Another story of breakfast with a Confederate general. And again, it's John Gordon, the same general that Jim talked about at the Aldland House. He now has breakfast on Monday, June 29th with Mary Jane Rewalt. Well, he thinks maybe she's a Confederate spy. He thinks maybe she's in sympathy with the Confederates. But if you remember my chart on the politics of York County, Wrightsville and Pelham Township were decidedly on the Union side. And she tells the Confederate general that she's invited to breakfast with my assent and with my admonition, if you will. My husband's in the United States Army. He's a Union soldier. I'm not a spy, and I hope that our cause may prevail. Well, Mrs. Rewalt's mouthiness, if you will, to the general could have got her in a lot of trouble. Instead, he calls her the bravest woman that he meets, the heroine of the Susquehanna, that other than his sainted mother and his beloved wife, this was the person that he most admired, and that was a York County and named Mary Jane Rewalt. Go ahead, Jim. So let's skip the questions for a second, and let's go on to the next section. We'll collect all the questions at the end. All right, the last thing we want to talk about is the key role of African Americans. As we know, February, we're going to have speakers talking about the 54th Massachusetts. We've already talked about the Underground Railroad. Black people in York County, the first part of the war, were not able to serve in the military. There was a lot of controversy during the Gettysburg campaign about whether blacks were going to be actually allowed in the state militia. So a lot of black Home Guard units, including men that Jim referred to earlier, from Columbia and southeastern York County, fought at the Battle of Wrightsville. They were volunteers, didn't have on uniforms. Well, later that year, men from York County did put on uniforms, and they joined the United States Colored Troops, which were federal troops that had been approved by the United States Congress. Go ahead, Jim. So we just want to talk about just a handful of the black people. John Aquila Wilson is one of the only known people to have served both at the Defense of Wrightsville in this Home Guard unit, if you will, and also in the formal U.S. Colored Troops. He was a young man. He was a teenager at the time of Wrightsville. At the time he died, he was the last known Civil War veteran to die in York County who was from York County. Served in the 32nd United States Colored Troops. You see him with a Lincoln impersonator as well as with the last Civil War soldier in York Borough, a man by the name of Ike, E-I-C-H, on the left. Barton family at Wrightsville had 5 brothers who all served in the regiment in this war in 5 different U.S. Colored Troop regiments. So you can see we spread our guys out, and some of these guys had health problems the whole rest of their lives. Go ahead, Jim. We had a number of other family units that served as well. James and John Harris were from Fawn Township. Now, at the time of the Civil War, southeastern York County still had a fair number of African-American individuals that lived in that region, including the Harrises. They served in South Carolina, and like so many Civil War soldiers, black and white, their health was wrecked for the rest of their lives. Now, not to think that African Americans were the only people of color to serve from York County. We have at least one case of a Native American. His name was Henry Bear. Lives in Wrightsville. He served in the 127th United States Colored Troops. And again, he was a Native American. So you can read a lot of his story as well in the book. Jim, go on to the next slide, please. And the final thing I want to talk about is just 5 of the misconceptions. Very often people talk about the fact that Jeff Stewart commanded all the cavalry that went into York County, commanded all of Robert E. Lee's cavalry. No, he didn't. He commanded 3 of the 7 brigades of cavalry in Robert E. Lee's army during most of the Gettysburg campaign. The cavalry that came with Jube Worley did not report to Jeff Stewart at that time. The cavalry that came under Major James Noonan from Carlisle and rode through York County down to Dover and back on June 28th and June 29th, again, did not belong to Jeff Stewart as well. Another thing I hear quite frequently, it's kind of surprising when I moved to York County, how many people think Robert E. Lee and George Pickett came to York County? In fact, there's an area just near Conewaga Creek called the Pickett Road area. No, that was not named for George Pickett. Robert E. Lee, the closest he ever came to York County would have been just in the fields east of Seminary Ridge. George Pickett, of course, went to the Cadore Farm at Gettysburg. That's as close as either of these 2 men ever came to York County. Another misconception that I read in a lot of books is that Union soldiers burned the bridge at Wrightsville. Well, no, they didn't, technically. The commanders of the troops ordered, as I mentioned earlier, 4 civilians who actually burned the bridge. And in fact, one of the guys that lit the fuse on the explosives that were first used to try to drop the bridge was, quote unquote, an old Negro man, a fellow by the name of Jacob Rich. John Burns was the only Pennsylvania civilian to fight the rebels. No, that's not true either. Confederate accounts say the women in Hanover shot at them from the second story windows of their homes in downtown Hanover. And at Wrightsville, we have accounts of civilians from York County that fought at Wrightsville, both black, of course, home guard people, but also regular civilians who gathered there as well. We don't know how many, but there are fleeting accounts of them as well. So yes, there were civilians long before John Burns ever set foot in the Gettysburg battlefield on July 1st. Here in York County, our civilians were already fighting against the Confederates. And the final thing I want to mention is, and we talk about this in the book as well, is a misconception that Abraham Lincoln was actually photographed in Hanover Junction. I don't believe he was. I think these photographs show other individuals that were taken the day before Lincoln arrived, in my opinion. But again, ultimate teaser, come read the book. With that, Jim, move on to the next slide. Now, so Jim and I both want to thank you for your time. We realize you've been patient for the last period of 55 minutes or so that we've been speaking. We do want to take a few more questions, so if you need to leave, that's fine. If you want to hear the questions, Adam, if you don't mind reading them, and Jim and I will answer them to the best of our abilities.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. I'm just scrolling back through the chat. I think I'll start with the chat and then we'll move over to the question and answer application, just because I know there are several questions on there. All right, this first question, excuse me, is from Gary, and he asks, why was Carroll Township Democratic? I'm not sure if that's easily answered or not.
Well, in 1860, it wasn't. It was solidly Republican. But by 1864, as people were frustrated with the United States government, they were very, very upset in part of York County that the U.S. government didn't do more to stop the Confederates from coming in the 5 counties in south central Pennsylvania, Franklin, Fulton, Cumberland, Adams, and York, counties that most of those counties tended to vote anti-Lincoln just because the people were so upset about the lack of protection. So,
I'm just impressed. I'm impressed someone would wonder about Carroll Township. That's one of the most obscure townships in your county. Good for you, Gary.
to work. Okay. I wanted to do these as chronological as I could, but anyway, skipping back a little bit. Was the hospital at Penn Park segregated based on race? And if so, why?
There were 14 wards in the U.S. Army Hospital. I wrote an article on it for Gettysburg Magazine in 2019 that I'm reprinting in a new book Jim and I are coming out with in November of 2021. There were 14 wards in the hospital. There was one for Native Americans and one for Blacks. That was because the Army was segregated. We had U.S. colored troops. They did not allow African Americans to serve alongside white troops. And in fact, for much of the war, Black soldiers had to fight under white officers. So segregation was Army policy during that period of time. And as such, the U.S. Army Hospital indeed was segregated.
Scott, do you want to talk about the Confederates who were treated or not treated at the hospital, but treated nearby?
Yeah, very quickly. There were over 200 Confederates were brought to York County after the Battle of Gettysburg. There were significant damage to the hospital that the Confederates had did during the occupation of York. They'd also captured the chief surgeon, the director, supervisor of the hospital. And upon his escape during the Battle of Gettysburg, he came back to York, whipped the hospital back into shape, but used the excuse that they were all out of beds. And so they rented space in the Oddfellows Hall, and the Confederates were segregated from the Union soldiers. So Union soldiers were treated at the U.S. Army Hospital, more than 1,000 of them, after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the 200 Confederates were treated at the Oddfellows Hall.
Which still stands, is now known as Washington Hall, at the corner of, I guess that's King and South George.
Yes.
All right. Okay, our next comment is from Bill. This is Bill Landis. This comment is for you, Jim.
Hi, Bill.
He's wondering why not a lot was made of the Hanover Junction, well, I guess of Hanover and Hanover Junction, and specifically Hanover Junction's connection to Lincoln and the skirmish there. Why wasn't a lot made of it until the two of you wrote about it? Because he said if he had known about it when he was younger, he would have visited the site and paid more attention to it.
Well, I'll start on that, and then Scott's an expert on Hanover Junction area. But I would just say that there's a lot of the Civil War that wasn't discussed. I alluded to that earlier. Between George Prowse's book in 1907 and George Sheets's in 1982, there's very little done on the Civil War. George Sheets dealt with that to some degree, but the momentum didn't start until after Dr. Jezierski's book started in 1999 on Goodridge. And then Scott Mingus's Tsunami, as I always say, started after that. And so it's not surprising that Hanover Junction wasn't covered, because a lot of the Civil War wasn't covered in any detail anywhere. But Scott, you want to talk about Hanover Junction?
Yeah, just very quickly, I realize we're running out of time. But yeah, when I wrote the book Flames Beyond Gettysburg, nobody had ever, on a national level, had ever talked about Hanover Junction, the surrender of York, or the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge, which is why that book, up until this year, was my best-selling book of all time, been passed by one of my other books since then. But, yeah, I mean, I think that brought a lot of attention on a national front, in fact, international front, because I gave a talk on that to the via Zoom to the London, England Civil War Roundtable last year because COVID canceled my trip to go speak to him in person. So I think Jim's correct. There just wasn't a lot written about this area. And so it stayed out of the national books because people didn't know, even though the official records and all the military records were there, just people didn't talk much about it.
Okay. Trying to sum up. This kind of goes back to the Underground Railroad. This question is from Ronald. Was Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, and Corning, New York, were they part of the Underground Railroad?
Wellsboro or Wellsville?
Wellsboro. Good distinction.
Yeah, tell me about Wellsboro. Being an Ohioan, I don't necessarily know all the towns that are outside of York County. in
Those are
Pennsylvania?
northern tier. Those are northern tier towns of
That's
Pennsylvania.
what I thought.
I-
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, I can trace the Underground Railroad activity along through the Williamsport, Selinsgrove area. But as far as the rest of northern York, northern Pennsylvania, that's not something I've studied to any great degree.
All right. This question, going back to politics, had York County historically split? I guess this is pre-Civil War and pre-Republican Party. Had York County historically split between Democrat and Whig?
Jim, you can take that one.
Yeah. York County voted Democrat, or what was the Democratic, Jeffersonian and Jacksonian parties all the way from around 1800 until about 1920. There's one break, I think, in 1906 where they went with Republican, but for the most part, York County was always voted for the Democratic Party throughout the 1800s. And that was because I talked about to some degree, but the fact that we were so exposed to the South. The South was the party of Jefferson, the Democrats were the party of Jefferson, the Democrats were the party of Jackson. It was an agrarian economy. We were connected with Baltimore, which was in the South. And so the democratic concepts and ideas found stronger root here in York County than Republican ideas. We fought over in Europe to try to get out of strong kings and strong rulers. So when we got here, particularly the Germans who got here, if we saw anything like Abraham Lincoln, ordering, bringing us into a war, well, we were tired of that. That happened over in Europe. So why would we put up with that over here? So, well, the answer is, well, because people were enslaved. And so we should have backed Lincoln, but we didn't. But that was some of the background. It goes all the way back to our roots in Europe. And then as we faced to the South, we tended to back Democrats, and Democrats ran against Lincoln. Obviously, Lincoln was Republican, and so we had that clash. So that's a real quick snapshot. But we were solidly Democrat through all the 1800s.
Okay, I believe we have two more questions. This question is from Barbara. I understand you could buy out your draft, pay for a substitute, basically. Is there any place to research this activity?
Yeah, it goes back to the fact that most of the soldier records from York County, Dennis Brandt, Jim alluded to it earlier, Dennis did a lot of great work on the pension records of soldiers from York County. So if you go to the YCHC's website and you search through the military records, military documentation page, you will find Dennis Brandt's records of York County. They do include more than 1,000 residents of York County that were involved in the war or had connections to York County. Some of whom died in York County, moved here after the war. Dennis includes them all. And so in that, he does talk about people who hired substitutes. You paid $300 for a substitute soldier. And yeah, that's all documented in there. So again, maybe Adam, you can at some point give the actual website out to folks if they're interested. Put it on the page for YCHC on the Facebook page. If you'll put that link for people and they can go and look at those detailed records.
Yeah,
I was going to say also to supplement that, a researcher by the name of Mark Snell wrote a master's thesis on the draft in York County, and where he gets into that type of stuff in a narrative form. The copy of that master's thesis is in the History Center archives. Very interesting and well done master's thesis.
Yep.
On Scott's point, I actually did put that link to the Dennis Brandt research in the chat, but that is a good point about putting it on Facebook. Right now, I think the functionality on our website is to search, basically do a name search to see what records turn up. but we have the full database on our drive at, in the library. So if people, it's a little difficult to view now, obviously, since we're closed, but that is something that in better times, you'd certainly be able to come in and browse through.
Hey, Adam, if I type the word in substitute in the database, does it come up? Or does it do a global
That's a
search?
good question. I don't know.
I know on
don't know
my
the answer.
database of York County claims, you can type in any word and
Okay.
it'll show up. If I can type in
Really?
Jeff Stewart, it shows up. I don't need to put in the name of the person.
Yeah, that's very possible. It's not a highly sophisticated search, but so usually when I'm thinking about using something like that, I'm always thinking in terms of genealogy and doing a name search to see if there's a record for a certain person. But yes, that's quite possible. Okay, I believe this is our final question from Christopher. Did York County have, and I'm assuming he's referring to the Civil War period because I certainly know a Revolutionary War example here, but did York County have any prison or internment camps?
Good question. Not during the Civil War. Obviously, there were people taken prisoner. Here in York, the Confederates took prisoners at Wrightsville. They took prisoners at the Battle of Hanover. Those prisoners were detained in the Confederate camps. They were not, to my best of my knowledge, actually put in any specific buildings that I've ever been able to trace. And then when the Confederates left York County, they took them with them. Confederate prisoners themselves, if the Union soldiers, were typically taken through York County. They would have been taken to Fort Delaware to the east. And then after 1863, the Northern Central Railway was instrumental in taking prisoners to a brand new prison camp in Elmira, New York. That was so infamous. It was almost the Andersonville of the North. It was called Elmira. It was such a deadly place. But a lot of those prisoners of war were again taken through York County. So there were no permanent full-time, camp security type facilities that we're familiar with the American Revolution or even during World War II.
It's just an interesting point that Scott has made to me before that that any place you had Confederate soldiers gathered, like and detained, like for example in the military hospital at Washington Hall, that was a prisoner of war camp.
True.
Anytime, so we had, to Scott's point, they were all temporary. They weren't holding pens like what we had in also the other one, Adam, is World War II. We had Camp Stewartstown, which was a prisoner of war camp. So we had two, and we had these temporary ones in the Civil War as well. And also, if the Confederates had prisoners, as they did, let's say in Dover, then the Confederates were operating a prisoner of war camp. They had detained soldiers. They paroled them there, but it depends how you want to define a prisoner of war camp.
Yeah, but there were no stockades, the Andersonville type stockades or Point Lookout or Fort Delaware. Those were the major prisoners of war camp. Fort McHenry down in Baltimore. We were surrounded by formal United States prisons for Confederate prisoners. So there was no reason to actually have one here in York County. And also keep in mind one other key point, if I may. We're just across from the Mason-Dixon line. You don't want to put a prisoner of war camp that close to the south. So you certainly wanted to put them in an area that was much better protected.
I would say that they also looked, and we had a military hospital here, a major league military hospital. They weren't going to put two of those in the same county. And even having a military hospital here, guess what happened? It was captured by the Confederates.
Exactly.
So you have a POW camp here, and they would go right towards that.
All right. It looks like Bill Landis raised his hand, so I'm just curious if he wants to ask a question. We haven't done that, but we certainly could do that. So I'm going to allow him to talk if he would wish to, but I don't think we have any other questions at this point. But I don't know. Maybe he was just waving.
I would just say I've emailed with Bill Landis 100 times in 20
All right.
and 30 years. I
Well-
never talked to him.
We'll tell you what, I do not see any. Oh, he just typed in a question. Yeah, I believe I answered this for someone else. No, I did answer. Bill, I did write you back about that in the question and answer, but Bill had asked about the general who's buried in Prospect Park. That is William Franklin. And we do have his papers at the History Center. Quite extensive papers, actually. So in case anybody's curious, we have a mammoth collection related to the Civil War. I'm working on a comprehensive spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet of every single resource we have, whether it's a library book or an archival resource. I'm trying to put everything in there with the goal of converting it into a format that we can put on the website and make it searchable and viewable for the general public. But we have a massive collection of things related to all sorts of subjects, and substantial records related to, I shouldn't say substantial records, it depends on the veteran, but let's just say there are lots and lots of things related to Civil War veterans. So
Adam, Mark Snell, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a full biography on William Franklin. Which
I was not aware of that.
Yeah,
it's in your archives.
Okay.
It's terrific, and it talks about the Franklin family was just enormous in the first 50 years of the and William Franklin, I should say that was helped design, maybe he was the chief designer of the Capitol Dome, the US Capitol. He was an engineer, West Point trained engineer. Wasn't the greatest general in the world, but he was very accomplished, and his family was involved heavily in the military as well.
And just to finish up on Franklin, he's obviously the highest ranking Civil War soldier from York County. He commanded half of the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Fredericksburg.
The only general officer to outrank him was Jacob Blackstabbers, a 4-star general in World War II.
We also have his papers at the History Center.
Yeah.
Which has been a constant source for various historians. All right, I believe we are caught up, and it is definitely time to adjourn for the night. So I'd like to thank you, Scott and Jim, for another excellent and comprehensive presentation. I encourage everyone to rush out. I'm sorry?
Jim, slow the next slide while he's talking.
There we go. Perfect. Here's the promotion. I encourage everyone to check out their new book, which as we can tell from tonight's presentation, adds quite a bit that does not exist in the previous editions. So, and we will have copies at the History Center. So please feel free to reach out to us as well. And we'll see everybody on, I believe it's February 17th for our next roundtable meeting.
Bye.
All right. Have a great night.